Properties of special parallelograms. We are going to look at the properties of the diagonals of rectangles, rhombuses, and squares. Alrighty, so a parallelogram is a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel to each other. A rhombus is a parallelogram with four congruent sides. The rhombus also normally makes a diamond shape. The rectangle is a parallelogram with four right angles. Right angles are 90-degree angles. The square is a parallelogram with four congruent sides and four right angles. A rectangle with four congruent sides, a rhombus with four right angles. Okay, so a square takes in both the properties of a rectangle and a rhombus. How these relate. Okay, so we have our quadrilaterals here. These are four-sided polygons. And in that, we have parallelograms, which means that opposite sides are parallel. Then we have rhombuses, okay, which all four sides are equal to each other. Then we have the rectangles, which have 90-degree or right angles for their angles. And then combining both of the rhombus properties and the rectangle properties, we have squares. Okay? Some quadrilaterals are parallelograms. All parallelograms are quadrilaterals. Some quadrilaterals are rectangles, and all rectangles are parallelograms and quadrilaterals too. Okay? Some quadrilaterals are rhombuses. All rhombuses are parallelograms and quadrilaterals too. So now I'm going to ask you, and you're going to answer if it's sometimes, always, or never. A parallelogram is a rhombus. Sometimes it is. It could also be a parallelogram, a square, or a rectangle. A square is a rectangle. Always. A square is always a rectangle. A parallelogram is a square. Sometimes. A rhombus is a rectangle. Sometimes, if it's a square. A square is a parallelogram. Always. So you should have an idea and keep this chart in your mind. So let's take a look at an example. True or false? The diagonals of a rectangle bisect each other. What we know is the diagonals of a parallelogram bisect each other. A rectangle is a parallelogram. The statement is true. True or false? Opposite sides of a square are parallel. What we know is all squares are parallelograms. Opposite sides of parallelograms are parallel. Therefore, opposite sides of a square are parallel, and the statement is true. Let's take a look at rhombus properties, okay? The diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. The conversion is also true. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. The diagonals of a rhombus bisect the angles. Notice that. Notice how the angles are not all the same, only the opposite ones are congruent. We're going to find the angle measures in a rhombus. So remember though that the rhombus has been labeled A, B, C, D, going clockwise. So angle 1 is 90 degrees because the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. Angle 2 is 61 degrees because of alternate interior angles theorem. Angle 3 is 61 because the diagonals of a rhombus bisect the angles. So if you add up angle 1, angle 3, and angle 4, they equal 180 because they are in a triangle. If we put down our measurements of 90 and 61, we can now find angle 4. So what is the value of angle 4? That's right, it's 29. The diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. The converse is if the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. Do you know properties of a rectangle, rhombus, and square, which have congruent sides? The rhombus and the square have congruent sides. Which ones have congruent diagonals? The rectangle and square have congruent diagonals. Which have four right angles? The rectangle and square have four right angles. Which have diagonals that bisect each other? All three have diagonals that bisect each other. True or false? The diagonals of a square are perpendicular. True. Remember, a square is a rhombus, and a rhombus's diagonals are perpendicular. So diagonals tell us a lot. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, the parallelogram is a rectangle. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, the parallelogram is a rhombus. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular and congruent, the parallelogram is that's right, it is a square. Thank you for participating. The end.